The sterile glow of the research station pulsed with a quiet hum, its artificial lights casting long shadows against the smooth metallic walls. Zwirval, a scientist of the esteemed Veloran species, stood over the containment chamber, their translucent fingers hovering inches above the reinforced glass. Inside sat the subject, an anomaly, an enigma, a creature of contradictions, a human. Zwirval had spent cycles observing the specimen, recording its erratic behaviors, its unnecessary movements, its ceaseless vocalizations. It laughed in solitude, sighed without cause, and often muttered words to itself in a rhythmic, almost melodic tone. But today, Zwirval's curiosity had reached a breaking point. There was something about the creature's biology that made no logical sense. Its reaction to physical stimuli defied Veloran understanding. They had seen it during the initial medical scans. The human's heart rate would spike when an instrument brushed against its skin. A slight pressure on the shoulder caused a shudder. Once, an accidental slip of a mechanical arm had grazed the creature's abdomen, and it had burst into uncontrollable laughter, its entire body convulsing as if possessed. The Velorans had theorized that the human was malfunctioning, but prolonged observation proved otherwise. This was normal behavior. Zwirval exhaled, a slow, deliberate motion meant to focus their thoughts. The subject, identified by the name Ethan, stared at them through the glass. There was no fear in his eyes. If anything, he seemed amused. "You're staring at me like I owe you money," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. His voice was casual, yet his expression betrayed the slightest hint of intrigue. Zwirval ignored the remark. Velorans did not engage in pointless verbal exchanges. Their species thrived on precision, logic, and above all, efficiency. Words were a crude and unnecessary tool when minds could communicate directly through neural resonance. The human's inability to receive telepathic signals was yet another biological flaw. Ethan stretched, his arms lifting above his head, muscles shifting beneath his skin in an almost fluid motion. His joints popped, and Zwirval flinched. That sound, it was internal, yet the human showed no signs of distress. "I require further analysis." Zwirval finally spoke, their voice smooth, almost melodic in its precision. "Your species displays involuntary reactions to minimal physical contact. This is inefficient." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You mean, like how I flinch when something touches me?" Zwirval's four pupils dilated slightly. "Yes, that." Ethan smirked. "It's called reflex, buddy. It's kinda built into us. That is an inadequate explanation." A pause. Then Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the metal table. "Let me guess. You wanna test it, don't you?" Zwirval hesitated. A strange unease crept into their thoughts, though they could not understand why. Physical contact was meaningless among Velorans. Their bodies were composed of smooth, semi-translucent exoskeletal layers, adapted for durability, not sensation. Touch carried no emotional significance, nor did it provoke an autonomic response. The idea that a species could be biologically programmed to react to something as simple as a touch was beyond comprehension. Ethan grinned. "All right, Doc. Go ahead. Do your worst." Zwirval did not waste time. In one swift, calculated motion, they reached out, their elongated fingers brushing against the human's forearm. The reaction was immediate. Ethan's entire body jerked, his muscles tensed, a visible shiver rippling through his skin. He exhaled sharply, a sound that was neither pain nor pleasure, but something in between. His pupils contracted for the briefest of moments before he let out an abrupt, involuntary chuckle. Zwirval retracted their hand as if burned. Their heart chamber contracted violently. What was that? Ethan, still grinning, rubbed the spot where he had been touched. "Damn, that was weird. Felt kinda electric." Zwirval's mind raced, neurons firing in rapid succession. The data did not align. The human had not been harmed, Yet it had reacted. It had produced an audible response, a sound of amusement. The pulse beneath its skin had accelerated. Even stranger, its temperature had increased slightly in the area of contact. Why? The Veloran scientists straightened, trying to regain composure. "Explain," they demanded. Ethan smirked, resting his chin on one hand. "You wouldn't get it. I must understand." Ethan leaned closer, eyes gleaming with something that Survival could not identify. Something unreadable. "You ever heard of being ticklish?" Ticklish. The word meant nothing to Survival. But in that moment, standing there in the cold clinical chamber, they felt something they had never experienced before. An unsettling curiosity. And for the first time in their existence, a Veloran hesitated. Survival could not stop thinking about the human's reaction. The way his muscles had tensed, the involuntary shiver that ran through his body, the sharp exhale, none of it was logical. It was not a defensive mechanism, nor was it an indication of pain. And yet it was a reaction, a response to mere contact. Standing in the dimly lit research chamber, Survival reviewed the recorded data, replaying the exact moment their fingers had brushed against the human's arm. The numbers made no sense. There was a clear, measurable spike in heart rate, electrical nerve activity, and even temperature in the affected area. But why? Why would physical touch induce such an erratic, unpredictable response? Ethan sat on the other side of the chamber, watching the alien scientist with an expression of mild amusement. He had seen that look before, the sharp intensity of an academic caught in the grip of a mystery they couldn't solve. He stretched his arms above his head, his muscles shifting in an oddly fluid motion that fascinated Survival. How could a biological structure be so flexible and yet maintain its form with such precision? "You're overthinking it, Doc," Ethan finally said, resting his hands behind his head. "It's just how humans are wired." Survival's gaze snapped toward him. Wired. The alien's voice was smooth and neutral, but the way their pupils contracted signaled heightened focus. "Your biological composition is not mechanical." Ethan smirked. "Not literally. It's just instinct, reflex. Some parts of our body are more sensitive than others. If you touch certain areas, you get a reaction. It's harmless." Survival processed the information. Instinct, reflex, sensitivity, words that implied randomness, unpredictability. They did not like that. Velorans were precise beings. Their own biology followed a rigid, controlled structure. There was no space for involuntary responses or meaningless sensations. To think that a species could be so chaotic was disturbing. "I require further analysis." Survival took a step forward, their elongated fingers flexing slightly, prepared to conduct another test. Ethan chuckled. "Oh, you want to try touching me again? Getting a little bold there, aren't you?" Survival ignored the teasing tone. The human was an anomaly, a mystery that had to be solved. Without hesitation, the alien reached out and placed their fingertips lightly on Ethan's shoulder. The human's reaction was different this time. Less intense, but still noticeable. A brief shudder, a subtle shift in posture. No laughter, no sudden jerks. The alien tilted their head slightly. The reaction was inconsistent. "I did not observe the same response," Survival stated. "Well, yeah," Ethan shrugged. "Different spots, different reactions. If you touched my ribs, for example, I'd probably laugh again. But my shoulder, not as sensitive." Survival's pupils contracted as their mind processed this new piece of information. Different areas of the human body reacted in different ways. That meant this phenomenon was not universal across the entire biological form. There was a pattern, a structure. It was not completely random. That thought gave Survival a strange sense of relief. Ethan, seeing the scientist lost in thought, smirked and leaned forward slightly. "Want to see something weird?" Survival's gaze snapped back to him, curious. "Touch the back of my neck." The alien hesitated for a fraction of a second, then carefully extended their fingers. The moment they made contact with the human skin, Ethan shuddered violently, his entire body reacting with an abrupt, involuntary motion. His breath hitched, and a visible goosebump pattern formed across his arms. Exurval quickly pulled their hand away, stunned. The reaction was far stronger than before. It was instantaneous, as if some unseen force had passed through the human's body the moment their skin connected. Ethan exhaled sharply, laughing under his breath. "Yeah, that's a weird one. Gets me every time." Exurval's mind raced with possibilities. The human's biological system was hardwired to react to certain stimuli in ways that defied logic. The same physical contact in different areas produced completely different results. Some touches caused laughter. Others caused shivers. Some were ignored altogether. This was beyond simple biological response. There was something deeper here, a system they did not yet understand. For a long moment, the alien scientist remained motionless, their thoughts spiraling through possible explanations. Then, without a word, they turned and began inputting data into the console. Ethan watched them work, tilting his head. "You're really obsessed with this, huh?" "I must understand," Exurval said without looking up. "This inconsistency is unnatural." Ethan grinned. "Says the guy with 4 eyes and a telepathic brain." Exurval ignored the remark, focusing on the data. The human body reacted instinctively. But instinct implied evolution. That meant there had to be a reason for this. They needed more data, more subjects, more variables. Their gaze flicked to Ethan. One human was not enough. This experiment would have to be expanded. Exurval stood in the dimly lit laboratory, staring at the data projected on the curved display in front of them. Their mind was a storm of calculations and unanswered questions. Every logical pattern they had relied on to make sense of the universe was failing. The humans' involuntary reactions to touch made no sense. Worse, they were inconsistent. A simple brush against the arm had caused a mild response. Contact with the back of the neck had resulted in a full-body reaction, and yet touching the shoulder barely elicited a response at all. Why? The Veloran scientist replayed the recorded footage again, watching Ethan's body tense and shudder in real time. The human had no control over it. This was not a conscious act. It was something deeper, something instinctual. That made it even more fascinating. An unconscious biological trigger that varied in intensity depending on the location of touch. That should not be possible. Exurval exhaled slowly, then turned toward the containment chamber where Ethan sat, drumming his fingers against the metallic table. The human was utterly at ease, completely unconcerned with the fact that he was being studied by an alien species. That, too, was perplexing. Most creatures, when isolated and studied, displayed signs of distress or aggression. But Ethan, he laughed, he joked, he even seemed amused by Exurval's confusion. Perhaps it was time to test another subject. Without a word, Exurval pressed a control panel, activating the secondary containment chamber adjacent to Ethan's. A mechanical hum filled the air as the reinforced walls slid apart, revealing another human. This one was female. Exurval observed her carefully. Her physiology was slightly different from Ethan's, but still within the same structural framework. Bipedal, flexible musculature, smooth skin with a slightly different shade, and a similar facial bone structure. If the reactions were truly a species-wide phenomenon, then she should react the same way. Ethan glanced over at the other captive, then looked back at Exurval. "Ah, so I'm not your only guinea pig. That's reassuring." Exurval ignored him, stepping closer to the new subject. "Your designation." The woman smirked. "You mean my name. It's Sam." Exurval recorded the information, then extended a hand toward her arm. Sam instinctively pulled back, eyes narrowing. That was new. Ethan had not done that. Ethan leaned forward, watching with interest. Might want to ask before you start poking people, Doc. Veloran ignored him again. They had to proceed. Carefully, they reached out and placed 2 fingers against Sam's forearm. No reaction. Veloran pressed slightly harder. Sam frowned but remained still. No visible shudder. No spike in heart rate. No involuntary twitching. Ethan chuckled. Yeah, she's not ticklish there. Veloran's mind reeled. Not ticklish. That implied variance not just in location, but in individuals. The same stimulus did not produce the same result. That was a direct violation of biological predictability. This was becoming more chaotic than they had anticipated. Veloran withdrew their hand and adjusted their approach. If Ethan's most intense reaction had come from the back of his neck, then logically, Sam should experience the same response. They stepped behind her, reaching toward the exposed skin just below her hairline. The instant their fingers made contact, Sam whipped around violently, slamming her elbow backward into Veloran's torso. The impact sent the Veloran scientists stumbling back, their multiple pupils widening in shock. Their entire species had trained for combat, yet they had never experienced an attack that was purely reflexive. It was as if Sam had not even decided to strike. Her body had simply reacted on its own. Ethan burst into laughter. Oh man, you just got reflex punched. That was beautiful. Veloran steadied themselves, trying to process what had just happened. It had not been an attack out of aggression. There had been no malice in it. It had simply been a response, a different kind of involuntary reaction. They inhaled deeply, a Veloran technique meant to stabilize their neural functions. Explain. Sam smirked, rubbing the back of her neck. You just hit a sensitive spot. Some people react by laughing, some people shudder, and some. She flexed her arm, grinning. Strike back. Veloran stared. Their species had studied countless life forms across the galaxy, but never had they encountered one that reacted so wildly different to the same stimuli. There was no universal response. Touch, for humans, was unpredictable. And that made them dangerous. The Veloran scientists paced, their mind racing. This changed everything. If a simple touch could trigger laughter in one human and violence in another, then how could one predict a human's reaction in any situation? How did their species function in an environment where every individual was wired so differently? You look like your brain is about to explode, Ethan said, still grinning. This is fun. I like being on the other side of the science experiment for once. Veloran exhaled sharply, then turned back toward their research terminal. They had been foolish to assume human biology followed a singular pattern. If they were to understand this species, they needed a larger sample size. More humans, more tests. They activated the intercom, speaking to the observation deck. Prepare for a controlled interaction study with additional subjects. We require further data. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Oh, you gonna start a tickle fight in a lab setting? This is getting weird. Veloran did not acknowledge his words, but a strange, unsettling feeling crept into their mind. They had thought of humans as intelligent but simple. Now, they were beginning to suspect the truth was the opposite. These creatures were not simple at all, and that made them unpredictable, which in turn made them a threat. Veloran stood motionless, their elongated fingers hovering just above the research console, eyes fixed on the newly recorded data. Every result, every observation pointed toward an unsettling reality. Human responses were unpredictable. Even worse, they weren't just inconsistent across different areas of the body. They varied between individuals. This was not how intelligent species were supposed to function. Velorans were precise, logical beings. Their biology operated on strict, measurable patterns. Physical contact served only a functional purpose: stability, the transfer of materials, or coordinated movement. There was no unpredictability, no emotional weight behind a simple touch. But these humans, they reacted. and not in a way that could be classified as purely sensory input. No, this was something else. Ethan, still seated behind the reinforced observation table, had watched the entire experiment unfold with what could only be described as entertainment. His arms were crossed, his face alight with amusement as he stole glances at Sam, who was still rubbing the back of her neck, smirking to herself. "So, Doc," Ethan said, rocking slightly in his chair, "figured us out yet?" Zurivol didn't respond immediately. Their mind was still processing what had happened. The female had reacted to their touch with a physical countermeasure. That meant humans weren't just passively experiencing sensations. Their bodies had the capacity to weaponize their reflexes. Zurivol's 4 pupils constricted slightly. That was disturbing. They turned to Sam, who met their gaze with an unreadable expression. The way she carried herself, the relaxed posture mixed with the ever-present readiness to react, made Zurivol uneasy. This one was different from Ethan. Ethan laughed when touched. Sam retaliated. The scientist folded their hands behind their back and studied her carefully. "Your reaction was not voluntary." Sam grinned. "You don't say." It was not intentional aggression, and yet it was immediate. Zurivol tilted their head slightly. This suggests a biological defense mechanism, one that does not require conscious thought. Sam shrugged. "Yeah, that's called a reflex. Some people jerk away, some people laugh, and some people—" She rolled her shoulders with a smirk. "Strike first. Ask questions later." Zurivol's mind spun. This was beyond unpredictable. If some humans reacted defensively to physical stimuli, it meant they possessed an autonomic combat response. That was extremely dangerous. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "I told you, man. Humans are weird." Zurivol ignored him. Turning back toward the research console, they began rapidly inputting notes, cataloging everything they had learned so far. Humans display involuntary reactions to physical contact. Reaction varies based on body location and individual sensitivity. Some humans react aggressively without conscious decision-making. This suggests an evolved survival mechanism to counter physical threats. Zurivol exhaled. This was a problem. Their species, the Velorans, had long abandoned physical aggression. Their evolution had streamlined all conflict resolution into pure intelligence, neural synchronization, and the exchange of knowledge. Their bodies were built for endurance, not combat. Strength was secondary to intellect. But humans had retained something primal, something dangerous. Zurivol turned back toward Ethan. The human was watching them with that ever-present amused glint in his eyes, like he was fully aware of how much his very existence was causing a crisis of understanding for the Veloran scientist. Zurivol spoke, their voice calm but weighted. "Does this response vary further in moments of heightened distress?" Ethan blinked, then laughed. "Oh, buddy, you have no idea." Zurivol's head tilted slightly. "Explain." Ethan leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. "You ever heard of the fight-or-flight response?" Zurivol narrowed their gaze. "No." Ethan smirked. "Oh, you're gonna love this." Sam sighed, already anticipating the nonsense about to come out of Ethan's mouth. "You're gonna dramatize this, aren't you?" Ethan ignored her, fully enjoying the moment. "See, humans don't just have one response to threats. Some creatures either fight or run, but we get options." He held up 3 fingers. "There's fight, flight, and freeze." Zurivol processed this immediately. 3 separate responses. "Yep, some people get aggressive when they feel threatened," Ethan said, nodding toward Sam, "like our lovely elbow-throwing friend here." Sam smirked, raising her hands. "Guilty." "Then you've got the flight response," Ethan continued. "You touch the wrong person. They panic, they bolt. No thinking, just run." Zurivol absorbed this new information, but Ethan wasn't done. He leaned forward, his grin fading slightly. But here's the real kicker: the freeze response. Xervol's pupils constricted. The term alone carried a strange, foreboding weight. Ethan tapped his temple. Sometimes the brain just shuts down. A person locks up, unable to move, unable to react. Heart rate slows, breathing gets shallow. Some people do it when they're scared out of their minds. Some do it when they're overwhelmed. He smirked again, though there was something almost eerie about it this time. It's like pressing pause on a person. Xervol's mind reeled. This was far worse than they imagined. If humans had 3 separate biological responses to the same stimuli, then there was no pattern, no predictability, no guarantee of a consistent reaction. If touched, a human might laugh, they might strike, they might run, or they might become completely immobile. This was not normal. The Veloran scientists took a slow step back, suddenly aware of how truly alien these creatures were. Their species had studied the biology of thousands of life forms across the known galaxy, but none of them had this level of chaotic variability in their survival instincts. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching the unreadable expression on Xervol's face. Kinda messes with your whole logical universe thing, huh? Xervol didn't respond. Because for the first time in their career as a scientist, they had no conclusion. No category to place this species in. No way to define humans in their research. They were not predictable. They were not controllable. And if their biology was built for adapting to any situation, that meant one undeniable, chilling truth. Humans were a species designed for survival. And that made them one of the most dangerous creatures Xervol had ever encountered. Xervol stood in the center of the research chamber, their mind a tangled web of contradictions. Every conclusion they had drawn about humans up until now had been shattered, reassembled, and shattered again. The notion of biological unpredictability was unacceptable. Chaos had no place in advanced species, and yet here humans were, thriving on it. Ethan sat with his usual relaxed posture, stretching his arms behind his head, while Sam remained leaning against the far wall, arms crossed. The 2 humans had displayed entirely different reactions to touch, further reinforcing the Veloran scientists' growing realization. There was no universal rule, no pattern. That was unnerving. Xervol exhaled sharply, their elongated fingers clenching and unclenching. This study required another approach. Another test is necessary. Their voice was calm, calculated, but the intensity in their pupils betrayed the frustration beneath the surface. A new hypothesis must be examined. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Len guess. More poking and prodding." Xervol ignored his sarcasm, shifting their gaze between the 2 humans. The previous tests have shown that human reactions to physical stimuli are inconsistent. However, there is one remaining variable left unexplored. Sam tilted her head slightly. And that is, Xervol took a step forward, their smooth exoskeletal fingers tightening into a fist. Not all touch is intended as a form of study. Some cultures use physical contact to communicate emotion. If human biology is wired to respond involuntarily to touch, it is possible that specific types of contact create entirely different neural responses. Ethan blinked. "Wait. Are you saying I must determine how a gesture of comfort alters the human physiological response?" Xervol stated. There was a moment of silence. Then Ethan burst out laughing. Sam, on the other hand, stared in mild disbelief. "Hold up. Are you saying you want to comfortably touch us?" Xervol nodded as if it were a completely reasonable scientific endeavor. "Yes." Ethan wiped at his eyes, still chuckling. "Oh man, this just keeps getting better." Xervol ignored his amusement. Human literature suggests that gestures such as hand-holding or embracing are used to establish emotional security. I must observe whether this alters the nature of the biological response. Ethan smirked. "Oh, you want to hug me, don't you?" The Veloran scientist's pupils narrowed. Hugging. Yes. That is an appropriate test parameter. Sam snorted. This is going to be the weirdest experiment of my life. Xurval stepped forward, positioning themselves directly in front of Ethan. The human grinned, spreading his arms dramatically. All right, big guy, bring it in. With rigid precision, Xurval raised their arms and wrapped them around Ethan's torso. The reaction was immediate. Ethan stiffened, his entire body tensed, a deep shudder rippling through his frame. But this time, it wasn't the same involuntary response as before. His breathing hitched, his shoulders rose slightly, and for the first time since the experiment began, he hesitated. Xurval remained still, recording every sensory detail. The human's heart rate had spiked. Their body heat had increased by 0.7 degrees, and yet they did not resist. The reaction was neither defensive nor fearful. It was something else. Slowly, Ethan exhaled, his arms coming up slightly before awkwardly resting against Xurval's back. Okay, yeah, this is weird. And Xurval released him and took a measured step back. Report your observations. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, looking baffled. Oh, I don't know. I mean, it was awkward, but kinda nice, I guess. Xurval's pupils dilated slightly. Nice. Ethan shrugged. Yeah, people hug for comfort. It's different from just being touched randomly. Xurval turned toward Sam, who took a deliberate step back, eyes narrowing. Oh no, I am not hugging you. This is necessary for the study, Xurval stated plainly. Sam shook her head. Yeah, no, I barely hug people I actually know. I'm not about to start hugging aliens for science. Ethan smirked. What? Scared it might feel nice. Sam shot him a glare. I swear to God, Ethan. Xurval processed the interaction with growing confusion. You both are genetically identical species, yet one human welcomes the gesture, while the other recoils. Ethan shrugged. Welcome to the chaotic mess that is human emotions. Xurval considered this carefully. Physical touch, it seemed, was not merely a biological trigger. It was an emotional one. Unlike the previous experiments, this was the first time the reaction was voluntary. The response was still unpredictable, but this time it was controlled. This changed everything. Touch was not just a sensory input for humans. It carried meaning. And meaning was a form of power. Sam, still keeping her distance, glanced at Ethan. Okay, I'll admit, that was weirdly fascinating. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his arms as if shaking off the experience. Yeah, no kidding. He turned to Xurval. So, what's the verdict, Doc? Xurval stood silent, mind rapidly processing this new data. The first experiments had proven humans had involuntary responses, but now this final test revealed something more unsettling. Humans could control those responses, if they chose to. That made them even more dangerous. Because an unpredictable reaction was one thing, but an unpredictable species that could choose when and how to use it. That was a biological weapon in disguise. Xurval slowly turned toward the observation panel and pressed a command, sending their latest findings to the Veloran High Council. Humans were not just adaptable. They were not just chaotic. They were self-aware. And that meant they were far more dangerous than previously assessed. Xurval remained perfectly still, their minds spiraling through the implications of what they had just experienced. For the first time in their scientific career, they were facing a problem they could not quantify. The simple act of physical contact had not only triggered involuntary human responses, it had revealed voluntary emotional control. That was a level of adaptability that defied biological predictability. It was dangerous. They turned to Ethan, whose expression had shifted from amusement to something more thoughtful. Sam still stood at a safe distance, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. It was clear she was still processing what had just happened, though she masked it well. Xurval's hands tightened behind their back. Your species is unusual. Ethan smirked. Yeah, you keep saying that, but you're still missing the fun part. The Zurval narrowed their four pupils. Fun part. Ethan leaned forward slightly, a knowing grin playing at his lips. You think this is just about biological responses, don't you? The Zurval hesitated. That is the foundation of this study. Ethan shook his head. No, see, you're making a fundamental mistake. You're treating human touch like it's just stimulus and reaction. But for us, it's so much more than that. Zurval's mind stilled. More than that, what other purpose could physical contact serve beyond its biological function? Ethan gestured toward Sam. Take her, for example. She's not big on touch. Some people aren't. But if she trusts you, really trusts you, then a simple touch can mean something completely different. Sam rolled her eyes. Are you seriously dragging me into this? Yeah, I am. Ethan grinned. Because unlike me, you don't like being touched. But under the right circumstances, you'd probably seek it out. Sam exhaled, looking away, as if the statement had hit something deeper than she was willing to admit. Zurval analyzed their interaction carefully. Humans did not only react to physical touch, they assigned meaning to it. That meant a single gesture could mean different things depending on context. Zurval's voice was quieter now. Explain. Ethan's grin softened into something more serious. Touch can mean comfort. It can mean trust. It can mean power or even fear. It's not just the physical sensation. It's what comes with it. The intention behind it. Zurval's neural pathways flickered with realization. Humans could assign emotional weight to a physical interaction. That was more than unpredictable. That was manipulative. Because that meant a human could control how another human felt, simply by touching them. Zurval turned their gaze to Sam, who was now avoiding eye contact. Is this true? Sam hesitated for a long moment, then finally nodded. Yeah, it is. Zurval felt something unfamiliar settle into their chest, a strange sensation that they could not immediately classify, something unsettling. Humans could not be controlled through logic alone. For the first time, Zurval questioned the intent of their own species. The Velorans had always assumed that lesser species could be understood, categorized, and ultimately guided toward a structured existence. But humans were not creatures that could be contained by observation. They were not predictable. They were not programmable. They were wild. Ethan watched the realization settle over Zurval's features. I think you just figured it out, didn't you? Zurval's throat tightened. This is not what I expected. Ethan's smirk returned. Yeah. That's the thing about humans. We never are. The Veloran scientists turned away, their mind filled with 1,000 unspoken thoughts. For the first time in their existence, they felt something entirely alien. It was not fear. It was not frustration. It was doubt. And for a Veloran, that was the most dangerous feeling of all. Zurval had never experienced doubt before. It was an emotion that had no place in Veloran society. Their species functioned on absolute knowledge, on precise calculations, on the assurance that the universe operated within predictable patterns. Emotions were distractions. Uncertainty was a flaw. But now, standing in the sterile research chamber, surrounded by the two most unpredictable beings they had ever encountered, Zurval could not shake the feeling that everything they knew was wrong. The study had begun with a simple question. Why did humans react when touched? But now, the experiment had taken on a far more dangerous implication. Touch was not just a biological function for humans. It was a tool, a weapon, a connection. And the worst part, humans understood this. They knew how to use it, how to manipulate it, how to wield it in ways that no other species could. Zurval had already submitted their findings to the Veloran High Council, but the data felt incomplete. There was one last test left to conduct, one final step in their research. They had to experience it themselves. The thought sent an unfamiliar shiver down Tyrval's spine. Velorans did not engage in physical interactions for emotional purposes. Touch, for them, was functional, never personal. Yet, here they were, about to willingly subject themselves to something they did not fully understand. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching the alien scientist with that ever-present glint of amusement. "All right, Doc. What's next? You've poked us. You've hugged us. What's the grand final?" The Xurival exhaled slowly. "I must conduct a final experiment." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what's that?" Xurival straightened. "I must determine if Velorans are susceptible to the same phenomenon." There was silence. Then Ethan's grin widened. Oh, this is gonna be good." Sam, who had remained mostly skeptical throughout the entire experiment, now looked up with genuine curiosity. "You mean, you want us to touch you?" The Xurival nodded once, stiffly. "I must understand if your species' ability to assign meaning to touch is a uniquely human trait, or if it is possible to induce such a response in an otherwise unaffected being." Ethan's smirk grew. "So, basically, you want to see if we can make you feel something." The Xurival hesitated. The way Ethan phrased it felt wrong. It implied vulnerability, loss of control. And yet, it was true. That was exactly what they were testing. Sam crossed her arms. "All right, but fair warning. We're a pretty touchy species. You sure you can handle that?" The Xurival squared their shoulders. "Proceed." Ethan stood up, stretching. "Well, since you hugged me last time, I think Sam should have the honor." He turned to her, grinning. "Simon, Sam. Let's see if you can break the alien." Sam sighed but stepped forward, examining Xurival as if she were assessing a challenge. Unlike Ethan, she did not take this lightly. There was something oddly intimate about the idea of making physical contact with a being that had never experienced it before. She reached out slowly, her fingers hovering just above Xurival's arm. "You sure about this?" Xurival inhaled. "Yes." Sam placed her hand against Xurival's forearm, her palm warm against the alien's cool, exoskeletal skin. The moment contact was made, Xurival expected nothing. No reaction, no change, no anomaly. But then, something happened. A strange sensation spread from the point of contact, something entirely unfamiliar. It was not pain. It was not discomfort. It was awareness. For the first time in their life. Not just in the way they were conscious of their surroundings, but in a way that made them aware of themselves. Their body, their mind, their existence. It was like a missing part of themselves had been suddenly switched on. A foreign warmth spread through their neural pathways, a sensation they could neither explain nor categorize. It was not logical. It was not measurable. It simply was. Xurival pulled back sharply, their pupils dilating in shock. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, that's a face I haven't seen before." Xurival opened their mouth but found no words. Their mind raced, desperately trying to process the new sensation, but it was like trying to grasp at water slipping through their fingers. It was not something they could define. It was simply felt. Sam studied them carefully. "So, what happened?" Xurival's hands trembled slightly before they tightened into fists. Their voice was quiet. "I do not know." Ethan grinned. "Oh, you felt something, didn't you?" Xurival's throat tightened. They did not want to admit it, but there was no other explanation. The moment Sam had touched them, something had changed. Something had activated. For the first time, Xurival felt vulnerable. And that was a terrifying realization. The Veloran scientist turned away, their mind racing. This was not what they had anticipated. If Velorans, a species that had abandoned emotional connections in favor of pure intellect, were still capable of experiencing something from a simple human touch, what did that mean? Had they been wrong all along? Ethan crossed his arms, smirking. Guess what, Doc? You just got your first taste of humanity. Orville clenched their jaw. They had believed they were studying humans, but now it felt like the humans had been studying them. This was not just an experiment anymore. This was a fundamental shift in understanding. Ziraval had come here to categorize humans, to label them, to control the narrative. But humans were not a species that could be neatly cataloged. They were chaos incarnate. And worst of all, Ziraval was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, they liked it.